Spring, 1943. A Luftwaffe ace over occupied France catches his first glimpse of America's new fighter. He squints, then laughs, because what's rolling into his airspace looks less like a weapon and more like a flying bathtub with wings. He radios his wingman. 7-ton milk bottle incoming. For a brief window of time, he wasn't wrong. The P-47 Thunderbolt stumbled badly in its first weeks of combat. Outclimbed, outturned, losing more planes than it shot down. But that laughter didn't last long. That same milk bottle would go on to destroy over 7,000 enemy aircraft, collapse the German logistical network, and make Luftwaffe pilots dive for cover at the mere sound of its engine. This is the story of how that happened. The plane nobody wanted. To understand the P-47's rise, you have to understand just how bad its reputation was. On both sides. When American pilots first assigned to the P-47 in England saw the machine, many of them had been flying the nimble British Spitfire. The contrast was jarring. The Spitfire was a thoroughbred, lean, responsive, elegant. The Thunderbolt, by comparison, felt like driving a freight train. One pilot from the famed 4th Fighter Group put it bluntly after his first flight. "It damn well ought to be able to dive. It sure as hell can't climb." Even RAF pilots who looked over the plane shook their heads and quietly informed their American counterparts that they were about to die. And the stats backed up the pessimism. In its first 2 months of combat, P-47s flew over 2,000 missions and claimed just 10 German aircraft, while losing 18 of their own. The math was ugly. The Luftwaffe had already figured out the playbook: drag the American giant into a low-altitude turning fight, and it was dead. It seemed like the flying milk bottle was exactly what everyone thought it was. What nobody yet understood, including most of the men flying it, was that the P-47 wasn't broken. It was simply being used completely wrong. The secret hidden in plain sight. The P-47 was the creation of Georgian-born engineer Alexander Kartveli, who made a deliberate and controversial decision when tasked with building America's next interceptor. Instead of optimizing for the kind of sleek, low-altitude dogfighting the Europeans had perfected, Kartveli built his entire aircraft around one thing: the most powerful piston engine on the planet. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, eventually pushed past 2,800 with water injection. For context, the prized engine in a Messerschmitt Bf-109 produced somewhere between 1,400 and 1,800 horsepower. The R-2800 didn't just have more power, it had a fundamentally different nature. Unlike the liquid-cooled inline engines powering Germany's finest fighters, the R-2800 was air-cooled. Its cylinders arranged in a radial circle. No fragile coolant lines. No vulnerable fluid-filled tubes threading through the fuselage. German pilots were accustomed to a single well-placed cannon shell severing a coolant line and watching their target spiral out of the sky. Against the P-47, that tactic often failed completely. The engine would absorb punishment that would have vaporized anything else and keep running. But the engine alone wasn't the real secret. The real secret was what fed it. Tucked behind the cockpit and snaking the length of the aircraft was the General Electric turbo supercharger, a system unlike anything the Luftwaffe had encountered. Powered not by the engine itself, but by its own exhaust gases, this turbo spun a compressor at over 20,000 RPM, scooping up thin, cold air at altitude, pressurizing it, and ramming it back into the engine. The result was extraordinary. while German fighters, dependent on mechanical superchargers, began gasping and losing power above 25,000 feet. The P-47's engine was just hitting its stride. At 30,000 feet, the frigid, oxygen-starved realm, where the heavy B-17 bombers flew, the Thunderbolt became something else entirely. Fast, responsive, dominant. The milk bottle had a secret the Luftwaffe hadn't bothered to look for: learning to fight like a Thunderbolt. Technology alone doesn't win wars. Tactics do. The early disasters with the P-47 came from pilots trying to fight Germany's game. Tight, turning, low-altitude dogfights where agility ruled. It was the equivalent of sending a heavyweight boxer to compete in a gymnastics event. The results were predictable. The shift came when commanders like Colonel Hubert Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group, later known as Zemke's Wolf Pack, stopped trying to make the Thunderbolt something it wasn't. Instead, they built tactics around what it actually was: the fastest diving, hardest hitting, most indestructible fighter in the sky. The doctrine was called boom and zoom. P-47 pilots would climb high, higher than their German counterparts could comfortably follow, then pick their targets from above. When a Bf-109 or Focke-Wulf 190 appeared below, a Thunderbolt would tip over and dive. And in a dive, gravity grabbed that 8-ton machine and turned it into something terrifying. It could push past 500 miles per hour in a steep descent, speeds that could literally tear the wings off lighter aircraft. The attack lasted seconds. A wall of fire from 8.50 caliber machine guns capable of unleashing over 100 rounds per second. Then the Thunderbolt would use its accumulated speed to zoom climb back to altitude, reset, and hunt again. There was no duel, no elegant exchange. It was a precision execution from an altitude German pilots simply couldn't match. Lieutenant Glenn Schlitz of the 56th Fighter Group described one such engagement in January 1944, punching into a formation of about 20 Messerschmitts, shooting the leader off first, then watching his wingman just sit there in shock. He shot him down too. By late 1943, German intelligence had quietly reclassified the P-47. It was no longer a joke. It was a priority threat, a fortress that refused to die. Perhaps no quality defined the P-47 more than what happened when things went catastrophically wrong. On June 26, 1943, Major Robert S. Johnson's Thunderbolt was ambushed and shredded by at least 21 cannon shells and hundreds of machine gun rounds. His canopy shattered. The cockpit was on fire. He was wounded and trapped. The damaged canopy wouldn't open. In a desperate dive, the flames went out. Limping toward the English Channel, barely flying, a lone FW-190 closed in for the kill. The German pilot poured everything he had into the wreck of Johnson's aircraft. Pass after pass. When the German finally ran out of ammunition, he pulled alongside. He looked across at Johnson, a man he was certain was already dead, rocked his wings in a salute, and turned for home. Johnson flew that aircraft, riddled with over 200 bullet holes, back to base. That story wasn't unique. It was the Thunderbolt's defining pattern. German pilots who had spent the war watching enemies disintegrate under cannon fire now poured ammunition into the giant American fighter and watched in disbelief as it flew on. As one Luftwaffe ace described it, fighting the P-47 felt like industrial execution because the P-47 was the one doing the executing. The angel of death comes down low. By 1944, with the longer-ranged P-51 Mustang taking over bomber escort duties, a lesser aircraft might have faded into obsolescence. The Thunderbolt didn't. It found a second calling and in many ways, a deadlier one. As a fighter bomber, what German soldiers came to call the Jabo, the P-47 carried up to 2,500 pounds of bombs plus rockets. It flew at treetop level across France, hunting the arteries that kept the German war machine alive. Railroads, supply convoys, fuel depots, tank columns. 16 Thunderbolts could trap a convoy of trucks in open road and turn it into a chain of burning wreckage before the drivers had time to react. From D-Day to VE Day, Thunderbolt pilots claimed to have destroyed 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. The German logistical network didn't just suffer, it collapsed. The distinctive sound of the R2800 engine became something soldiers learned to dread. German tank commanders, who had once ruled European battlefields, stopped moving in daylight. The psychological toll had a name: Jabo fever. At the sound of a thunderbolt overhead, entire units dove for cover. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander in the West, admitted that Allied air power had made meaningful troop movement nearly impossible. The joke had become a siege engine, the industrial philosophy that sealed it. There is one final element to the P-47's dominance that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The Luftwaffe's strength was built on irreplaceable expertise, elite aces who had honed their skills over years of combat. Every pilot lost was a blow that couldn't easily be absorbed. America's approach was fundamentally different. A total of 15,579 P-47s were built, more than any other US AAF fighter, and they equipped 40% of overseas fighter groups in 1944 and 1945. At the production peak, a new Thunderbolt rolled off the line every hour. While German training programs withered under fuel shortages, American pilots arrived at the front with hundreds of hours of flight time. Nearly 200,000 pilots were trained over the course of the war. The loss of a plane was recoverable. The loss of a pilot was replaceable. Germany had no answer for an enemy that kept replacing everything it lost, faster than they could destroy it. Adolf Galland, general of the Luftwaffe fighters, was asked after the war what truly defeated his air force. He didn't cite a single battle. He pointed to the sky over Germany, darkened by swarms of American fighters that hunted his men to exhaustion. The P-47 was the steel instrument of that hunt. By May 1945, the P-47 had closed its account with a kill-to-loss ratio of better than 4-to-1 across more than 500,000 missions, the most produced American fighter in history, and one of the most feared weapons in the European sky. The lesson it leaves behind is simple: never judge a weapon by the fight it wasn't designed for. The milk bottle was never meant to dance at low altitude. It was built to rule the sky above 30,000 feet, and then come crashing down like an avalanche on everything below. The Germans figured that out too late. If this one grabbed you, hit like and subscribe. There are plenty more stories of machines that changed the course of history. You won't want to miss them.